Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to another art video. Today we're going to be painting a dog, my dog actually, in India ink. So I hope you enjoy the video and we're going to get started here. Now I already have my dog here sketched out really lightly in pencil. I have the most pencil marks in the eye portion of the dog. The eye was a very big center point of this drawing, so I wanted to make sure I got those reflection details right and made sure I wanted to look at the dog in the final drawing and really see my dog looking back at me, you know? So I paid a lot of attention to the eye details. And right now I'm just going through with some masking fluid. This picture, the original picture, I'll put it up here in the video right there. This original picture he has snowflakes on his face. It looks super extra cute. He's a cute dog anyways, but with snow on his face, it's super extra cute. So I'm just using my masking fluid to mask off those little snowflakes as well as some hair where I want it to stay particularly light in his ear and places like that. Just to make sure I keep those crisp whites for the snowflakes especially. And then I'm going to go in with the eyes. Normally, I would leave the reflection of an eye almost completely white at the beginning, but I think that I did a couple of really light washes over his eyes before I started excluding the reflection part of the eye, mostly because I wanted the white of the snow to be the main white of the piece, and also because he had a very shiny look to his eyes that didn't really reflect a complete white, like a really hard white highlight like you sometimes get with studio lighting, and when it's really bright out, sunny and such, you'll get a really hard light in the eye. But this was an overcast day when the picture was taken. It's very snowy out, the light is very diffused, so he's got not quite as harsh of a light in his eye. And I'm being really, really careful. I started the eyes first for this piece because I think it's just kind of fun. I like having a cool looking eye looking at me from a really blank piece of paper. I just find that kind of enjoyable. But I'm making sure to be really careful with his eyes because, like I said, there's a lot of personality that comes through in a dog in their eyes. So I'm carefully outlining the reflections, and I'm carefully outlining the tear duct, and because dogs, just like people, they have lash lines and tear ducts and things like that, and you really have to look carefully at your reference photo and make sure you get those little details, because you get a couple little details wrong in a face, you can't, and it just doesn't look correct anymore. It doesn't look like the face of what you're drawing. And people understand that when it comes to human faces a lot of the times, but the same thing is true with animal faces. They've all got varying details and personalities in their face, so I try and put that through as much as I can. And now I'm starting in on the fur with some really, really light gray washes where I know that it's going to be the darkest. On his nose and some of the black parts of his fur, I'm just very, very carefully, with a very, very light ink, washing in some of those darker shadows, just blocking them in a little bit. Again, with India ink, you have to be really careful to get all of the blending you want to do done before the ink dries. The ink dries and it is permanent. You cannot re-wet it like you do with watercolors. And really, I found that with India ink, this was actually the second or third time I attempted to paint fur like this. The first dog I did was also in India ink, and then I did, I think, a snow leopard. I think it was a snow leopard in watercolor before this. So I was still kind of experimenting with fur here. I still am kind of experimenting with fur. never really stop experimenting. That's my art advice for this video. Never stop experimenting, because you'll be surprised what you can do in the end. But India ink, as I was saying, it made for some harsh lines in the final product. It made some of the fur look maybe a little harsher than I would have liked. I like the softness of watercolor, especially for a really fluffy dog like this. I think I might try in the future doing a base coat of watercolor and then doing some of the sharper guard hairs and little whiskers and things like that on top with ink. I think that might be a fun experiment. Now I'm just very slowly continuing to fill in these spaces where his face is the darkest. And you can see I started adding in a couple of really dark hairs up by the ears, where it's very, very black, where I know it's going to be very, very black. And there you see I'm going back in with the eyes. I think I did a couple of layers on the eyes. Even if you think something looks good, looks finished on a blank piece of paper, as you start filling in more details around something like the eyes, then you'll notice that you need to change maybe the value or the tone or how the reflection looks in the fur. It's an always evolving process, painting something complicated like this. And now I'm adding in some little caramel brown colors. I think for most of this color I mixed a nut brown India ink with a little bit of canary yellow India ink to get this sort of caramel tone. That is the main color, aside from black, that my dog is made up of. He's a pretty boy. He looks like he's actually half German Shepherd and half Belgian. Tervuren. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but it's the Belgian that gives him that really fluffy, long face look that he's got going for him in this shot. Particularly, he's looking up at me in the snow. And now I'm just going back and forth, slowly but surely, with my brown colors and my gray colors, just adding in these furs bit by bit. Really, the most important thing I found with fur is to be very, very patient and to make sure that you are always moving your brush in the direction that the fur is going. Look back at your reference photo. This is another good instance of why it's important to use a reference photo, because you need to refer back to that photo a lot so that you can make sure their fur is going in the right way. That's what's going to make your dog look good, is making sure all of those strokes are going in the direction that they should be. Don't get lazy partway through and just start haphazardly putting fur in there. I know I've totally done that before, and I'm sure I did that a couple of times in this painting, but really pay attention to the brush strokes when you're making fur. It makes all the difference. And now I think I decided, after I got in mostly where I wanted the browns and mostly where I wanted the blacks in an initial layer, I put in a wash of that caramel color over most of the entire dog, just because he's got a soft undercoat of fur. You can see some of those lighter tones even underneath where he has black fur too. And here I'm using my fan brush. When I drew a husky, I used the fan brush all the time, and it made it look, he looked a little prickly, I think. So I used the fan brush here and there for this dog when I wanted a couple of particularly, I don't know, fanned out bits of fur, to look like. But I didn't use the fan brush overall too much, because I wanted a more fine-tuned, I wanted a more careful control over the direction of my fur, like I was telling you earlier. So I mostly used just this one little watercolor brush. I think I used mostly that one watercolor brush for this entire piece. It's a little, what are you? I don't know. I don't have my watercolor brushes right here. I can't remember what number the brush is, but I'll have it listed in my materials list, so you can check that out. That's at the beginning of the video if you missed it. And now I'm just starting to darken up. I've got all of my colors planned out. I know where I want the tones to be. I know I've got my color mixing done. The color mixing actually took me quite a long time to get that perfect little caramel color, because you end up with it being too brown or too yellow, or I added a little bit of crimson in there as well to like warm the tone up a little bit. But I ended up going through 3 or 4 color mixes before I found one I really liked, and the color mixing is more important than I think a lot of people realize. You have to be careful to put the right colors in the right spot. That sounds a little elementary, but most people don't pay quite enough attention, I think, to getting the right colors in the right spot. And that's what's going to make your piece really stand out. So now that I've got all these places mapped out, I'm going in and I'm darkening it up. And I'm making sure as I darken it up to maintain that directionality in my brush strokes, because even if you cover up the ones underneath, they're still gonna show through a little bit in the layers of fur. And that's another reason it's so important to build up your layers slowly when doing an animal like this, because that fur, it's a 3-dimensional object, that fur. You can't draw it as if it's only the surface area of the fur, the part that you see that's there, or else it's not going to look like a fully realized coat of fur. You've got to start with those bottom layers and build up from there, so it gives it more of a 3-dimensional look to the fur, like it's actually an object that's covering up this dog and not just a single layer of something painted on. I did pay a lot of, here I'm going in with the eyes a little bit more. I'm darkening up the fur around his eyes. He's got a nice dark mask of fur around most of his eyes, so I want to make sure I really get that in. I did spend a lot of time on his eyes. I'm so preoccupied with them today too, because just yesterday, my dog, his name is Archie. His full name is Archimedes, we named him, but we always call him Archie. But just yesterday, he got poked in the eye with a stick, and we had to take him to the emergency vet. So watching his beautiful eyes come to be in this drawing is almost a little emotional for me. I was so worried for him when that stick got caught in his eye, but we took him to the emergency vet, and they took really good care of him. He ended up with a scratch on his cornea, so we have to give him some pills and a couple of different kinds of drops for a few days, but he's going to make a full recovery, and his beautiful eyes will be just fine in the long run. I'm so glad. But my dog and I, we had an interesting time this week, so I suppose this is the perfect time for this video. Perfect timing. And now I'm just filling in his ears. His ears I found to be far more complicated than I initially thought they would be. I put some masking fluid in where the lightest part of his fur was sticking out of his ears, and when I took that off, it looked terrible. I knew it would. You have to shade that in again after you've taken the masking fluid off for an application like that. But adding depth to his ears and getting like the color of the light going through his ears right there, like making his ear look like a little cave, like how an ear looks, like you can see inside of it. It was more complicated than I had initially thought it would be, especially with how fuzzy his ears are. Now this part was what really made his mask start to show up. I got my darker gray color, my darker black color, and I started outlining where the caramel color stops on his face is what I was trying to outline. But you can still see all of those caramel tones through the black fur. Even though he has a black mask, there's still those caramel tones underneath, and that's really important. And because I had those caramel tones all over, it was much easier to pick them out with the black than I think than it would have been if I had just gone back and forth with the black and caramel the whole time. There's another round of those eyes, those beautiful eyes. They turned out so well, though. I think that his eyes are probably my favorite part of this whole piece. I might do another drawing in the future that's just a close-up of his face, just so I can focus on his pretty eyes some more. Just darkening all this up. It can be, when you start out with such a light shade of gray, like you should definitely, but when you start out with such a light shade of gray, sometimes it can be hard to know how far to go with your black, especially with a black. Recently, I just painted a black German Shepherd, and that was a really interesting challenge, painting an all black dog. But even with something like this, where he's a mix of the black and the brown, it can be hard to know how far to go with your black colors, especially because once it dries, it's never quite as deep of a black as it is when you lay it down wet. So you end up having to go over even the places where you think it's going to be as dark as it should be. You end up having to go over it again and sometimes again a couple of times to get that really dark contrast to work out. So I'm just filling in his eyes here. This is going so fast. I had to speed this up 10 times. I think this was a 5-hour process, just doing the coloring and the painting. I spent at least 5 hours doing this little puppy. It's time-consuming doing fur. It is time-consuming doing fur, but it's worth it if you take the time, because it always looks really cool when you're done. And now I'm doing his nose. And the nose of a dog I also found to be quite a particular challenge, because there's very few really hard edges on the nose of a dog, and all of the shading, it's just an amalgamation of very fine light shifts and color shifts, and you have to do it very gently in order to get it to look, like a dog's nose instead of just like a black square that exists on the front of their face. And it's not just black, like almost any dog, the very top of their nose in a photograph or in a drawing is going to be very, very light, almost completely white, because a dog's nose is so wet. There's going to be the reflection of the light on that wet nose. So if you look at a photo of a dog, they almost always have that really light reflection off their nose. And I find that a lot of people miss that when they're drawing a dog's nose, because they think this dog's nose is black, therefore he's going to have a black nose. But there are tons of subtle little color shifts all throughout the nose that shift from black in the nostril where it's darkest, where there's no light at all, to gray around the corner and edges as you fold the nose up toward the top, to almost white right at the top where the light reflects off of it. And his nose in this picture doesn't have a super bright white highlight at the very top, because again, this was a diffused color day. The light was kind of diffused. There wasn't a lot of direct sunlight. Oh, there I'm putting in the deck. I was worried about that deck, but when you're doing a background like that, because he's standing on a snowy deck in my backyard is where he is right now, looking up at me at the back door. And I was worried about the deck because I was trying to decide how to depict the boards covered in snow, but it's a background. It's a background to the main subject of the piece, so it really serves you better to not think too hard about that background. Just make sure that it's identifiable as what you want it to be, but try and keep it free of a lot of detail, because you don't want the focus of your drawing to be the background, unless it's a landscape, I suppose. But even in a landscape, you're going to have a point of focus, and the point of focus for something like this is obviously the dog and not the background. So not too many details in that background, and not even too many details in that foot. because the focus of this piece is not just the dog, it's the dog's face and his eyes looking up at you. So even his body that you can see behind his ears, between his ears, and his foot that you can see sticking out is much less detailed than the face. Oh, he's really coming together now. I'm starting to put a couple of soft washes of color in a couple of different places, trying to really smooth over his fur so it looks more like a uniform mass instead of a bunch of tiny brush strokes. That was where I ran into some trouble with the India ink. It's harder to soften your strokes with India ink because, like I said, you can't just re-wet your paper and soften those hard edges. You have to cover them up then with a semi-transparent layer of color. I just mix it with water. I don't use any sort of medium with the inks. I just mix my inks with water until it's the transparency that I want it to be. And now I'm adding in some shading, some little eye hairs, outlining that mask a little bit better. It's all just a process of very fine adjustments. You just look at a picture. If you get stuck with a picture, just look at it for a while until you can find one small thing that you can think to change, that you can change right then. And then make that tiny change, and then look at it again and see if you can find another tiny change that's not quite right that you can fix. There are so many details to a dog's face. If you're not a dog owner or not a pet owner, because it's the same for cats and other animals, even birds and snakes, they all have their own, well, maybe not snakes so much. My snake, he's got sort of a personality, but he mainly keeps to himself. But everything has a personality, and everything has distinct facial features, and you've got to hone in on that quite a lot with dogs and cats and animals, because they don't have as many facial features that we as humans would recognize as distinct from one another. So you have to pay a lot more attention than you normally would, I think, because you got to look for those distinctions, or else it's just going to look like a dog. And I didn't want it to look like just any old dog. I wanted it to look like my lovely little dog right here. I'll see some of those highlights on his nose are really starting to pop, and I finally managed to soften up the look of his forehead there a little bit. I struggled with softening his forehead quite a lot. There were so many sharp little lines. Oh, now I'm bringing his body out to the left there. I had actually accidentally made him a little too skinny. That's another point for your reference photo. I looked at it and I was like, I can see part of his fur on the left side of his ear there, and I hadn't depicted that in the picture. So it was looking a little off and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So when I extended his fur a little bit off to the side of his ear, all of a sudden it looked much better. And those are those little details you've got to look for. Just keep an eye out for something you can change, and then change it. I'm adding in, see, a little bit more of a reddish tone here as I get toward these top layers. Adding in a little darker reddish tone. He, I think in real life, maybe does not have quite as many red tones, but I thought it looked really nice, contrasted with all the cold snow. So even on an individual dog like this, you can take little creative liberties in order to make it look good as a composition. Because you're not recreating a photo like you're a copier. You're not a copier or printer or a scanner or anything like that. You're an artist. And you can take little liberties with your subject in order to make it look good. Now I've got my black ink. This is the first time, actually, believe it or not, in this piece that I'm actually putting in straight black without diluting it at all. And that's because I'm nearing the end here. I'm getting to the point where I can add in pure colors because I know exactly where I want them to be. If I had started adding in these pure colors way at the bottom, he wouldn't look nearly as three-dimensional as he does now. He's got a lot of depth to him, and that's those 5 hours of work paying off right there. And I think I do have a full version of this video, not sped up at all. But I don't know if you'd be interested in a 5-hour video. If anyone is, then be sure to let me know, because I've got it if you'd like it. Now I'm painting in his little toenails that you can see just peeking out from the fur there underneath his feet. Can't forget that little claw in the back. He's still got that dew claw hanging down in the back there. Just adding in some darker furs. Once I get to this point is when I started being more careful with individual furs around the edge. I think some of my favorite fur work in this piece was on the right side of his face, where the fur sweeps up and you can see it against the snow. Those tiny little strokes I paid really close attention to, because I wanted them to show up really starkly against that snow. Now I'm just filling in some more of his nose. He had some darker tones on his nose there that I hadn't represented yet. Snow is really interesting to represent in artwork, because you end up just making little gray or blue or bluish gray shadows to represent where the snow bends away from you, because the snow, when it's pointed right at you, is white. It's interesting to represent, but you have to make sure to get those gray tones you see, especially under his nose. You see how I put those gray tones under where his nose is, and it popped his nose right away up into a more three-dimensional sort of look. It made it pop out, because you've got to represent the depths of the piece, or else it'll look too flat. You've got to show that depth a little bit more. And I flicked a little bit of white ink on there for some of the smaller little snowflakes that I didn't get with the masking fluid. And there's my fan brush again. I'm just using that for texture mostly, getting some little flyaways, and because sometimes when you're making individual strokes of fur and you're paying really close attention to the direction of the stroke and how it's supposed to lay, you can get a little too uniform, and it looks a little too mechanical, like Android dog maybe. So you've got to randomize it a little bit, because sometimes the fur is swept in a different direction, or blown in the wind, or ruffled from playing around with his balls all the time, his sticks and such. And so you got to allow for a little randomness in that fur pattern. And those whiskers, oh my gosh, I was so worried about those whiskers, because you get this really great drawing that you're starting to get really happy with, and then you've got to put these stark little lines over top of everything, and it's a little nerve-wracking, but you just have to kind of go for it. And again, make sure you're getting your directions all right, and you're looking at your reference photo, seeing how the whiskers lie in real life. And here I'm just putting some extra darkness around his eyes, because I really want his eyes to just pop out of this picture. So I'm making sure that the area around his eyes are especially dark. But see, what makes the eye look especially realistic right here is this left one in particular, is you can see a little bit of the white around his eye, just a little bit, because a dog's eye is a little bit different from a human's eye. You don't see as much white, but there's still a little bit if you look at it. And you've got to make sure to represent those lighter tones, or else it's not going to look like the dog's actual eye. And there's where I put off that masking fluid. You see how terrible those furs look in his ear? Ugh. But I took off the masking fluid, and these are where his little snowflakes are on his face, and it looks very, very stark right now. But we're going to go in, and we're going to add in some little spots of gray in the snowflakes themselves to convey depth a little bit, and then we're going to add a little bit of shadowing around the individual snowflakes so that they look like they're resting on the dog's face and not a part of his face. Now here I'm going in with some lighter highlights around the edge of his face. This is just my caramel tone that I have been using, the mixture of the nut brown and the canary yellow, mixed in with some white India ink to lighten it up, to give it more of a highlight feel. And I added that in around the top of his head and around the sides, just to give it a little bit more of a contrast to all of that black, all of that lovely black on his face mask. He's looking really good. His ears are even starting to shape up a little bit now. He's coming along really well. This is the point. It gets to a point where you have to decide when to stop, because it's easy sometimes to stop too early. You could work on it more, make it look better. But then it's just as easy, I think, to work on it too much. You see, I'm adding in my little shadows, my little color inconsistencies on my snowflakes there. But you have to know when to stop, because it is easy to overwork a piece like this that's so detailed. And sometimes you just have to back away for an hour or two and come back to it and judge then whether or not it's finished. See, I got his soft fur on the forehead there. I got my little shadows. He's looking good. And there he is, all finished, looking like a cute dog. It's my Archie. I think this ended up being a good dog. Like I said, with the India ink, I feel like parts of it were a little too harsh, a little too stark. I do want to try something similar to this again with, like I said, the watercolor initial base and then some inking over top for those sharp little whiskers and guard hairs and things like that. But he turned out well. He's a handsome boy. He certainly is. Thank you all for coming and watching me paint this dog in India ink, and I hope it's giving you some inspiration to paint your own dogs in ink or watercolor or acrylic or whatever you prefer. Anyway, thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you in my next video. Don't forget to subscribe and like and share and all of that good social media stuff if you enjoyed my video, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye. Goodbye.